Well, good day, everyone. Welcome to the Ideate Software online user group. My name is Richard Taylor with Ideate Software, and we're going to begin here in about 3 minutes. I have 3 minutes to the top of the hour. So thank you very much for attending today. Before we begin, I just want to mention that we do have the question panel, and you can always type a question into the question panel, and I'll be monitoring that. And we can try to answer the questions as best as possible. We would like to make this very interactive. We have some polls that we're going to be asking you some questions, so hopefully it'll be fun and you'll get to learn all about parameters. So again, don't be shy. Keep us busy with asking questions, and thank you very much for your attention today and your time. Like I said, we'll begin here in about 2 minutes. You know, while people are joining, it's always helpful to just make sure that our volume's okay. If you can type into the question panel and you can find us. Oh, actually, Brian, thank you so much for doing it already. I'm going to ask if you can hear me, and Brian says it sounds good. So we appreciate that.
I feel like Brian actually read your mind because he seemed to have answered the question
I know.
before you. Yeah, it's impressive.
I was going to say Denver's in the house. Yay. Thank you, Brendan. Well, we're going to begin here, like I said, in about a little over a minute at the top of the hour. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this Ideate Software online user group, primarily focused for the Americas, just because of the time zone, but we might have some European and some Asian participants as well. So again, if you just joined, we have the question panel. Please feel free to type questions along the way. We'd like this to be very interactive. We also have some polls that we're going to be asking you. So, feel free to find that panel. And it looks like, Daniel has said that, yes, he can hear us. That's great. Thank you. Excellent. We have a lot of people joining now. Yes, Scott, we're not actually showing anything yet. Scott mentions that he can hear us, but he can't see anything yet. So Sasha's going to begin here in a moment and just be sharing his screen, but we just thought we'd wait for people to join. But that's a good point. We want to keep you on your toes. It's all about anticipation, right?
Hey, Richard, this is Glynis.
Hi, Glynis.
Hey, how are you?
Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to ask, are we going to be able to unmute at the end of the session today? Is that our plan?
That is our plan, yes.
Okay, thanks. Hey, everyone.
Good morning and good afternoon, I guess, right?
Absolutely. Here on the East Coast, it just passed the 1 minute mark for 12 p.m. So I guess that technically afternoon. And especially if you're joining us from Europe, it's already the afternoon.
And we are getting questions about, are we recording? And the answer is yes, this is recorded as we speak and will be available to everybody once we process it and post it. And Richard, just as a quick test, you can see my screen, correct?
Yes, I can. It looks great.
Fantastic.
So yeah, the primary presenters here are going to be Jesika and Sash, and myself, Richard Taylor. I'm just sort of the MC kicking it off a little bit, and then you heard Glynis Patterson, who is our director of Ideate Software Development. She is the brains behind the whole organization, keeps us all on our toes. So she's also joining us today and will be helping us field some questions. So it's great. We've got a really nice group today. People all across the, I recognize quite a few people from across, again, primarily the Americas region. And if you don't know, I'm located in Boston, Massachusetts. Jesika and Sash are in Portland, Oregon, and Glynis is in New Jersey, northern New Jersey.
All right, Richard, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. What do you think?
I think that's perfect.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. I just want to take a moment and thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us for our November 2021 online user group. And the primary focus of today's discussion and presentation is on parameters. Want to just mention here, we have Jesika DiGregorio with us, and she's one of our software developers. And if you haven't met Jesika before or haven't interacted with her, today is definitely your opportunity. Jesika, if you want to say hi, please do so.
Hi.
And you have me, of course. I'm sure most of you have interacted with me at some point in time. My name is Sash Kazminejad, and I'm the Customer Success Manager for Ideate Software. With us, as most of you probably already heard, is Richard Taylor. He's our technical evangelist. Richard and also Glynis Patterson, who's joining us as well, who's our Director of Software Development. Both Glynis and Richard will be fielding questions, and so we'll go ahead and kind of get this going here. But if you do have any questions, please ask away. I want to keep both of them really busy during this presentation. All right, let's move on. All right, so today's agenda, what we're going to do for this parameters discussion is we'll kind of just do a brief parameters kind of recap. We're not going to go in depth here, but I want to just kind of give you just a reminder of some of the different situations. We'll start with a poll after kind of the initial presentation. We'll do some brief demos, and then we'll have a couple poll questions. And then Jessica's going to jump in and really get kind of under the hood and really talk about some of the changes to parameters, especially when we're talking about 2022 and moving forward. Some of the things that Autodesk is up to and some of the terminology, just to kind of help you understand. Then we'll kind of open this up to additional Q&A. That's when we'll give everybody the ability to kind of unmute themselves and ask questions. Again, because of the user group, this is not just a presentation, we want it to be interactive as well. For those of you who just joined, just to remind you, this webinar is being recorded. So it will be available on our website soon. And this is a big one right here. Fill out your questions in the questions panel. We'll definitely address those. But also at the end of this presentation, we will have a survey. Please take a moment and fill that survey out. We also, in that survey, ask a question if you'd like to join our beta testing program. We would love to have you on board. And so if you would like to join, just hit yes on that one, and we'll send you some further instructions on joining our beta program. Okay, without further ado, let's go ahead and get going. So I'm just going to give you a brief parameter recap. Again, this is very high level, nothing super fancy, but kind of like, I'd like to say Revit coordinates, shall we say. It's always a good idea to kind of look back and ask some of these questions again and just kind of refresh your mind on how some of this stuff works. So let's just talk a little bit about that. Now, one of the things I want to point out to you, if you have not attended some of the parameter primer presentations that we've done in the past, we have a part 1 and part 2. Be sure to go to our website. You can just look in the search field and type in parameter primer and you'll get the results. That's a little bit more in depth on some of the parameter information and how parameters work. Again, since this is a kind of a high level recap, we're not going to go through that whole presentation again, otherwise we'll be here for a couple of hours. But these are good reminders in case you do have some questions or want a refresher on parameters. All right, so as you are probably aware, there are many different flavors of parameters out there. It's really complicated, and even having used Revit for so many years now, I have to remind myself, like, what is the best situation and type of parameter that I should use depending on my project or my type of family or whatever it may be. And you can see here, this is just a list of some of the types of parameters, and maybe we can argue that some of these aren't necessarily parameters, like combined parameters as an example, but nonetheless they involve parameters kind of on some level. And it's kind of nauseating. It would be nice if there was a simple way to say we just have one type of parameter in Revit, but that's not the case. And each type has a real unique situation or a real unique use case. And I think it's really important to sit down and kind of map out your strategy for how you want to implement parameters and also manage them as well. Also here, this is nothing earth-shattering. This has been around for a long time, but also just a reminder on some of the parameter creation methods. Like for example, when we're in a family editor, just having a look at some of the parameter terminology here when you make a parameter. Like you can see here, these dialog boxes between these two look very similar. However, we're in a family environment and you can create a family parameter. And it's important to note that these are types of parameters that you may have no interest in scheduling or tagging. I think it's really important to be thinking about that. I think of like visibility parameters like show this or don't show that. That would be a type of parameter that you would want to make a family parameter. It's not anything that you intend on scheduling. However, if it's a special parameter that you do need to schedule, then you may consider creating it as a shared parameter. And then looking here, when you're in a Revit project, in a particular schedule, let's say it's a door schedule or mechanical equipment schedule or whatever it may be, adding a project parameter or a project shared parameter, as we call them, through that dialog box. And really the primary difference between this dialog box and just under the general project parameters add is that you can add, a parameter or create a parameter through the project parameters and then assign it to multiple categories, where in this situation in a schedule, that parameter is really being assigned to that particular category that you're in. But generally speaking, the parameter creation process is the same. When we look at things like global parameters, which we're going to talk a little bit more about today, global parameters are, created within the project. And then you basically can kind of map those values to particular elements within your model. I think it's important to note or remember that global parameters do not get assigned a category like you would do over here. They're agnostic when it comes to categories. And the other important thing to remember about global parameters, because this question does come up often, is how do I schedule global parameters? The answer is you don't schedule or you cannot schedule global parameters. And the reason why is they don't have categories. However, whatever values you set in here, and I guess it depends on the situation, when they get pushed into a parameter within a certain category of an element, that is the element that you end up scheduling, right? So the values will still schedule depending on the category, but you don't schedule these types of things over here. So just something to kind of keep in mind when you think about global parameters. Real quickly, this is kind of just very high level, nothing earth shattering, but as a reminder, the instance versus type parameters, when we look at it from a project perspective, right? And again, be thinking about should a parameter be a type-based parameter or an instance-based parameter, right? Very important things to kind of keep in mind. Now, over here it says project parameter, right? One of the things you want to keep in mind when you're creating parameters, and I always have to ask myself this question: if I need a new parameter, should the parameter apply to an entire category? Right? So, and again, I'm not saying you're going to use like architectural supplemental instructions number as a real parameter in here. I just kind of made this up. But let's just say for this sake or for argument, I guess, purposes, I want this to be a instance-based parameter, meaning each individual instance that's in my model can get a particular number, right? One thing to keep in mind when you're creating a project parameter is when it gets assigned to a category, every element of that category will end up seeing this parameter value show up in the properties list, right? And is that appropriate? Maybe ASI number is appropriate. However, be thinking about this. If you do create a project parameter and that parameter has nothing to do with other elements in that category, is that okay with you? And number two is, if it is not, then maybe you want to consider creating it as like a family shared parameter, right? Something that applies just to that particular element so that nobody can accidentally fill in that data in a schedule, right? So just something to kind of keep in mind when doing that. And, for type-based parameters, thinking about it's particular, or I guess it is assigned just to that particular type, be thinking about, should it be a type-based parameter? So for example here, Kobe type color, I mean, even think just the name of the parameter with the word type in it really implies that it's representative of that type. I have a toilet and it comes in this particular model and the only color option is white. That to me makes sense as a type-based parameter, right? All right, and then looking at families, again, because you can have family parameters as we discussed before, which those do not appear in schedules or tags, versus a shared parameter, which again can be scheduled and can be tagged. So a good example of an instance parameter, and I use a lot of, maybe I should be careful about what I say. I do like to use, instance-based yes/no parameters to toggle visibility. That's a really great example, right? Show the flush valve. Okay, fine. That's maybe more of a graphical type of thing. That would maybe be on a per toilet basis, potentially. You could also make it a type parameter if you wanted to, and kind of turn off all the flush valves in one click of a button. You can certainly do that kind of stuff if you want to. But also looking at, type-based parameters like recycled content, right? And again, you need to decide if that needs to be scheduled, then in this situation, it needs to be a shared parameter if you're going to apply it within the family. Now, if recycled content is going to apply to all the plumbing fixtures in your entire project, then maybe you want to consider making that a project parameter, right? Because again, you don't have to add that parameter to the family. It kind of, I don't want to use the word append, but it kind of almost appends itself when you make it a project parameter. But just kind of keep in mind, you really need to understand the different situations and when to use a certain parameter and when. Again, you can see here, there's a lot of stuff going on. And then, the reality is when you load up the families, when you create the global parameters, all this information really comes together in your project, right? In your RVT files, and we can even say are your template files as well. So things like, project shared parameters, right? So again, that's where you're in the project, you say add parameter, I click on, shared parameter, and I pick a parameter from my parameters list. That's the project shared parameter, right? And then the project parameter is one that, can appear in a schedule, but can't appear in a tag. That again goes back to, do I just want to go parameter add and just say, I'm going to put the ASI number, and it will apply to all, elements in a certain category, no matter where I get the content from, no matter, if it's internal content that I've created or I downloaded it from a manufacturer, that's great. I don't care to tag it, but I still need that information in a schedule. That's where it's appropriate to have it, in a project parameter scenario. And then the ones we didn't really talk about were like system parameters. These are those hard-coded, parameters that come with Revit. Things like project information type parameters or the view and sheet type parameters as well. And then of course, within system families, right, where most of us are probably familiar with like the fire rating parameter. It's a built-in type-based parameter, right? Mark value, type mark value. Those are all basically hard-coded built-in parameters. I remember many years ago asking the question like, hey, how do I delete some of these hard-coded parameters? The answer is you can't, right? So those are the ones that Revit builds in. And I, learned actually speaking with Jesika about like some of these system template parameters. There's other types of parameters that are built into Revit. And like if you look at some of the MEP related templates, there are other types of parameter information in there, like actual lighting load and motor loads and all of that. Basically, there's a ton of parameters that exist within Revit. And then again, global parameters, as we kind of mentioned, those are like those per project parameters, right? So again, they're not something that you pick from like a shared parameters file. It's nothing like that. You basically create them in your projects or in your templates. And again, the reason to create them in your templates is so that you can start with a template, create a brand new project, and those parameter values exist. Again, you can't schedule those particular parameters. They're agnostic when it comes to categories, right? But however, the values, the resulting values, you can schedule those based on whatever category you're scheduling. So just, a couple things to kind of keep in mind there. The other thing too, we've probably all run into this before, And I especially early on in my Revit career, I definitely was not understanding parameters. And we've probably all been looking for the old shared parameters file, right? Where did that thing go? I need to get some of the parameters from it. And that's a little tricky. Luckily, you can actually export shared parameters if you don't have a parameters file. You can write it into a particular parameter file if you want to, and change the category of it and kind of reconstitute that parameter if need be. But I wanted to point out this example here because I think it's a very appropriate one. Here's an example of two toilets, right? Both have a parameter called ADA compliant. They're both shared parameters. And if you look at the graphics of the dialog boxes, they both appear to be the same. And I'm guilty of this. Years ago, when I needed that shared parameter again, I was like, oh, I'll just recreate it. And the reality is you go to fill in the data or you go to schedule it and you realize that it's not, the values aren't populating. And the reality is, even though the parameters look the same, they may smell the same, they may look the same, like I said, the reality is they're not the same. And if you've actually explored a shared parameters file, you'll see this GUID, right? Which I believe stands for Global Unique Identifier. And the reality is that's how Revit identifies a parameter and how it can tie that information or associate it with a component, but also a tag. They both have to have the same value in order to talk to each other. So if you ever try to make a tag, make your own shared parameter, make the name the same and all of that, and you go to tag the element and the value's blank, that's because the GUIDs are different. And so if you look at the bottom here where I have just a real simple example of a plumbing fixture schedule, you could see in columns F and G that I have two ADA compliance. And the reality is that's what happens when you create two separate shared parameters in this situation. They're not the same, and that's not an ideal situation. One of the cool things that you can kind of do, it's kind of a, I don't know, it's maybe a partial workaround. When you do run into a situation like that, like where you have columns F and G, one of the nice things is you can say, look, I'm going to stick with the ADA compliant from column F. And what you can end up doing is you could say, hey, I want to add this parameter to all elements in the category. And then at least in this situation here, you can then transfer this data from here over to here. And you can use BIMlink to do that. You can say, I'm going to export these two columns of data, and I'll take the information from column G and copy it, and I'll paste it into column F, and bring that information back in to bring it into alignment. That's as long as you apply or add this to all elements in the category in this type of situation. But you can see, just by me working through this and talking about this, there's a lot of stuff going on with parameters. So again, really keeping a tight tabs on this, not just allowing everybody to create their own parameters and do whatever they want. Your project will get messy really quickly. And I can imagine with all the BIM managers here on today's call, they've suffered through all of this before because managing this data is not easy. And then here's one that may not be as well known to everybody, but I think it's an important one to kind of mention here. And this is this linked file parameters. And this is just using project parameters. I'm sure we've all worked on projects where we've had kind of our main Revit file that we're working in, and then we've linked in, let's say, consultant files, or we've linked in other models into our project, and then we're trying to schedule this data, right? And one of the neat things that you can do is if the project parameters are the same name and the same category assignment and so forth, if all that data lines up, you can actually schedule that information in a single column, as opposed to kind of what you see here where we get two columns of data. If you've never tried this out, you should play around with it. It's kind of fascinating. But like thinking about doors, just as an example here, where I have maybe a core and shell model, I have some doors that may be on the exterior, and then I have another model that's an interiors model, and let's just say a consultant's doing the interiors build out. If we want to schedule the same parameter information in the same column, be thinking about how maybe using project parameters may be a wise choice. Now, again, that's if you want to use project parameters as opposed to shared parameters. The real question is, do you want to schedule it and tag it? or do you just need to schedule it? Those are all things that you need to consider when deciding what type of parameter to pick. Again, you want to get that stuff in your BIM execution plan, get that stuff, hammered out before you just start modeling and doing things in your projects. All right, Richard, before I give a brief demo to everybody, I thought maybe it'd be good to just ask people in the audience, how are you actually currently using global parameters? So Richard, if I may have you go ahead and launch the poll, let's just get some feedback from everybody, because I want to talk a little bit about global parameters, but let's go ahead and get some information to see how or if you are actually using them. And if you're not sure, that's okay, but we'd love to get some information.
Yeah, and
So
I was thinking about this as you were talking, Sash. Global parameters is the most recent parameter addition. I think they were introduced probably about maybe 6-7 years ago in Revit.
Yeah,
I
that
believe it's
sounds.
2016.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Jessica.
That sounds about right. 6 or 7 years ago, right?
Yeah, I wasn't too far off then.
Yeah.
Wait, Brian's saying he actually loves global parameters.
He does. And
Right.
Brian actually has done some nice presentations on global parameters.
Cool. Maybe we can hear from Brian later.
And I learned something from Brian. I'm going to talk about it here in a moment, but thank you, Brian. I appreciate that. All right, looks like we have about 2/3.
Yeah, we're up to about 70%. I'll wait, see if we can get more people involved here, maybe up to around 80%.
Perfect.
And again, if you're unsure, that's fine. That's a good answer. I mean, we don't mind.
Yeah. And maybe, Richard, what we need to do is have a rule that says we need 100% voting, otherwise the poll stays open.
Then it'd be open for quite a while. Well, we're almost 79%, 80%. There we go. Why don't we go ahead and I'll close the poll then. Oh, actually, there's still some. All right, I'm going to give you a couple seconds and then I'm going to close this.
Perfect. Yeah, and then let's have you share the results.
So kind of a little bit all over the map, actually. Yeah,
it looks like we have about 30% that are not using them. 5% tried and gave up. That's absolutely okay. I would say these are the results that I expected, roughly. Even 5% using them extensively. That may be Brian. I know he's using them extensively, but yeah, that's. I'm feeling like this is kind of what we're hearing, right?
And it also, I think, depends on the discipline too. I think for structure, as an example, if you're the structure discipline, they tend to use the global parameters more than maybe architectural or MEP, just as sort of a blanket statement.
Yeah. No, I think that sounds about right. All right, perfect. Well, this is great. I'll go ahead and have you hide that, and then I'm going to switch over to Revit. So let's just go ahead and get into the demo. Richard, thank you for launching that poll. We'll have 2 more polls after this demonstration, but let's just go ahead and get started here. All right, so you should see my screen, and I'm going to just real briefly talk about 2 components here, two features here. Again, not earth-shattering here, but just kind of as a reminder. We're going to talk just a little bit about key schedule information, because I love key schedules, and some of the changes that happened finally between Revit 2021 and earlier and Revit 2022. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about global parameters as well. And then we're going to do the polls and have Jesika speak. But one of the things I want to point out in this Revit 2021 is there was a big limitation that has basically been going on for many years in Revit. I'm going to come over here to a hardware schedule, which is basically just a key schedule here. And one of the challenges I think that a lot of people ran into, and this is also like for occupancy calculations, is kind of a similar situation. But the idea of creating a key schedule here and assigning, shall we say, values for a particular, let's say, hardware group, right? I'm just using the out-of-the-box Revit example here. One of the challenges here is if I come over to the edit fields, you have the ability, of course, to create parameters, which is lovely, right? So it's really nice. But we quickly noticed, most of us did at least, that your only option here is project parameters. And the downside to that, once again, is it cannot appear in a tag. So what if you had a tag that needed that information? Well, this has been a challenge for eons, right? So the solution was you had to create, kind of a, shall we say, like a parameter for a tag that you would then basically schedule the results of, this field here as an example, let's say column F, and then you would have like column G as the tag value, and you'd have to copy those values from column F to G so you can get that information to show up in a tag. And we use BIMLink all the time for that. We'd say, okay, great. We'll take this column of information, export it out, paste it in here, bring it back in. But if any of the data changed, it was not synchronized, right? So this has been that issue for eons, okay? But thankfully, Revit 22 now actually solves that issue. And again, just gonna make this really simple here, but if I just come over to, let's say, a door hardware schedule, just as an example, and you can see this is not fully filled out, but that's not the point here. Looks the same as any sort of hardware group, but now when I come over to the fields over here, and I come over to the create, this is what we've been waiting for a long time. And again, why do we want a shared parameter? Because I want it to not only appear in the schedule, which it's what it's doing now, but I want it to appear in a tag. This is something that we've needed for a long time, right? So again, you just know the process. You come to shared parameter, you select it, etc. And the nice thing is it'll show up in this list just like a project parameter. But the big difference is, and again, this example I'm showing you here may not be exactly what you want to do, but what's really nice about this is you can actually assign these, the hardware group here, and it will fill in that information and I can tag it. So as an example here, if I select this door, and again, it could be a door, it could be a piece of mechanical equipment, it could be a column, it really doesn't matter what it is. But you can see here when I select it, I can see some of the information from that key schedule show up in this list, right? And you can manually, input that information if you need to. However, if I come down here to the door hardware group and pick, a particular group, let's say it belongs to A, what's nice is it fills in this information over here, which is what I want, and it puts a little equals over here that says the parameter is set by a key schedule, right? So that's something that is really, really, helpful in this situation, right? So I'm glad that they finally implemented this. It's been a long time coming, but I wanted to just kind of point that out to you, that you now have the ability, to do that. So if you weren't aware of this, this is a 2022 and newer feature. So be sure to check that out. It may resolve some of the challenges that you're running into. Okay. And I see a note from Tom here. We'll talk about that for sure later on. All right. Now, going back to this poll that we had over here, which is, how are you currently using global parameters? I would love for those folks that are using them minimally and extensively, if you get a moment, type in the questions panels, let us know how you're using them. It'd be great to kind of get an understanding, but I figured I'd just take a few minutes and just talk about global parameters. Again, what I'm showing you here isn't earth-shattering, but nonetheless, I wanted to just kind of mention some of the ways that you can use them. You'll see over here, again, I just have kind of an overall dimension that may represent the building width and depth, and I can certainly have one, for a height. If I come over to the Manage tab and I come over to Global Parameters, here's where you can create some global parameters. And the creation process for global parameters is very similar to creating, any sort of parameter in Revit. However, there is no option here to pick a category. Okay, so as I mentioned before, they have nothing really to do with categories, and you can't schedule the global parameters themselves. You can only schedule the resulting value from whatever category of information they're being pushed into. But you can see over here, I've created a few parameters that are just kind of reporting parameters. This door jamb from adjacent wall, maybe you have some sort of office standard that says, all your doors or all your furniture or all your equipment shall be some sort of exact value. I don't know, I'm just kind of throwing that out there, okay? And you can see I have some visibility ones, which is kind of the one that I had picked up from Brian Mackey. I was like, oh my gosh, why didn't I think about this before? But let me just show you real quickly how this kind of works. As an example here, if I take this dimension over here, normally when you assign kind of global parameter information, you'll see this little area right here in the properties dialog box usually has a button and you click it and you can associate it with a global parameter. In a situation with a dimension over here, you end up picking a label from up in here. And if I click over here, I could say, just show me the building, length, and it's a reporting parameter. And when I do that, it'll show up, in my global parameters dialog box, and I'll show that to you in a moment. And if I come over here and pick this, I could say maybe a building depth as a report. And what's interesting here too that I noticed, and we probably have to look at the units for it, but if I come back to the global parameters, we could see here that I'm getting, that reported information. And if I go to edit parameter over here, it's not really giving me the ability to kind of change the precision on it. I believe that's going to be a kind of project units overall setting, as opposed to the actual dimensional settings, which can be independent of the project settings. But nonetheless, I can get the information kind of reported in here if I wanted to. So that's kind of another example right there. All right, what else can I do with some of the global parameters? Well, and again, as I mentioned before, maybe you have some sort of standard that sets a minimum dimension from from a wall just for a door jamb. So let me just show you an example of what I'm talking about. If I come over here and let's say drop a dimension from here to here, and again, you want to make sure you hit the doors. This is just a simple example. We see people doing this for concrete slabs. We see people using this for ceilings, like ceiling plenums. Maybe they have a certain depth that they want, so they'll control it all from a global parameter. So in this example here, you can see I have this 3-inch and this 8.5 inch, and if I select this this dimension over here, again, I can associate it with a global parameter. You'll notice over here, I don't see all my other parameters in here. I just see this door from adjacent wall. And if I select it, you can see now they're both 6 inches, right? And if I click over here, you'll notice this little pencil over here. And that indicates that it is part of a global parameter. And if I click it, it is nice that it launches this dialog box. And if I make it 8 inches, I can hit OK, right? And you can see that they both change. So if you wanted to control that and kind of make it some sort of globalized setting, you can do it. Now, if you don't want this dimension to show up in your construction documentation plans, again, you can put these in working views. A little bit more subtle, maybe a little dangerous here is you can certainly remove those dimensions. And you can see here that it's still constrained. And if I hit OK over here, if I do come back to global parameters and let's say I make it 1 foot and hit apply, you can see they still move. And if you're looking for those dimensions, you can always hit the reveal constraints. And that's going to go ahead and show you those global parameters. If you need them to be completely wiped out, you can remove that dimension, from there. So that's another example. And the last one that I wanted to show before we do the polls and give the reins to Jesika is one that I picked up a tip from Brian Mackey. So thanks for this one, Brian, because this is one that I struggled with for a long time. I have a detail sheet over here. And I like my own grid system in here, and I'm using like a symbol family over here that kind of represents like 1 column by 1 row. And the whole idea behind this is it kind of lays out a framework so that I can kind of get my details and my notes kind of in alignment. And I know people out here use this. I use this all the time. And so one of the struggles that I had was, before I go to print, how can I control this? Now, I would have to easily remember to come over here, and if I had tons of these different sizes, depending on my detailing, I would have to come over here and say, okay, great, I got to go to edit type, and I need to turn off my detail guide like so, right? And then for my sheet, I would have to do the same thing. I'd have to come over here, go to edit type, and turn that off, and I have to do that for each one of these before I go to print. That's a lot of work, right? So instead of doing that, let me just go ahead and undo this. What I can do here is I can associate this with a global parameter. So you saw me earlier mention that you'll see buttons over here that help you with that, or that allow you to associate that. And so in this example over here, I can click on this and say, oh, I want to associate it with a global parameter. So this is my, my detail layout grids over here. And now you see it grays it out. And then the same thing for the title block. I can come over here, go to edit type, And in the same situation here, I can go ahead and say, yeah, show title block grids, right? So I would basically just do this for each type, and that's all I have to do rather than me going and finding each of these sizes and turning them off before printing. And then all I need to do is just come to global parameters and say, oh my gosh, let me just do that. And when I'm done, I'm ready to print. And then when I'm done printing and I need to go back and do some detailing, I can come back over to the global parameters and easily turn those on. So again, there's a lot of use cases for global parameters, but here's just a couple of examples that I wanted to show you here. And so with that, what I'm going to do here is ask Richard to launch polls 2 and 3, and then Jesika will speak, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Yeah, and Sash, I just wanted to mention that quite a few people have been typing in their use cases for global parameters. So I've tried to respond back to everyone that's a great use case, so that everyone can see basically the questions that they're not really questions, they're more like use cases that people were commenting on, and then everyone can share them. And all of them have been really great.
I love it.
Even the one, that sounds bad, from Brian that I hadn't completely thought about was like using it instead of design options. Was really interesting. But
yeah, that is an interesting one. See, very clever.
Yeah, I will go ahead and select here and the next poll. And so in this poll, as you should see it, what is your biggest parameter management challenge?
This will be an interesting one to see what the results are.
I think my biggest challenge is saying parameter management challenge 5 times fast. And looks like we've got about 65% of the vote, 68 people are chiming in, so excellent. All right. And like I said, we're going to wait till 80% here. So 77 we're getting close. And I am not surprised so far with what I'm seeing, the preliminary results. I don't think you're going to be surprised either.
Yep, I agree.
I'm going to wait just a little bit more until we get where it's 79. Yay! Almost there. A few more seconds, and then I'll close this. Hopefully we get up to 80% here. Yeah, we made it, 80%. All right, I'm going to close this poll. And I'm going to share the results. So it's not crazy information. It's sort of what I expected. I don't know if you want to make a comment on that, Sash?
Yeah, I honestly think the consistency across project files is probably the #1 issue. Again, if you're not setting a lot of this stuff up in your templates and you're kind of doing ad hoc and on a per project basis, and you're like, oh, we need a new project parameter, you go ahead and do that. Or you create a new project shared parameter, and you don't have a parameter file to reference from. So you make your own, and you can just see how this becomes a slippery slope, and then you have to create your own tags or modify a tag. That's definitely one of the biggest issues across the board. And then duplicate parameters, right? You just saw an example where I had 2 ADA compliance, and those in that case, those were 2 shared parameters, but having a manufacturer content where they create a lot of shared parameters with the goal of being able to schedule that information, right? And a lot of times they create way too many parameters, and so you start loading that stuff up, and then you go to create a schedule, and you're like, why do I have 5 of the same parameters? They're named the same, but they're all different. And you go to schedule all 5 columns, and you can just see where the mess ends up coming from, right? So I would say that's the issue. And yeah, too many parameters. I mean, the reality is sometimes people do create way too many parameters. Doors are ones that drive me crazy because I see a huge list of door parameters, especially instance-based, and I'm thinking, are people filling in all this information, and how much of this information are you actually scheduling? So I would say that this is definitely a big one for sure.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and hide that, and I'm going to do the last poll here. And again, we'll wait. And then I've got some questions I want to make sure that we answer kind of as a group too. I'm like the worst person at like multitasking. So I'm trying to read the questions and do the polls and and talk at the same time and chew gum.
Yep, absolutely.
So if you see like pauses here. All right, so we're about at 53%.
Yeah, they're starting to kind of get equal. At least a couple of the questions.
And you know what's funny is also, just as so as you guys are, or as everyone is typing in their answers, it's funny because several people have abbreviated global parameters to GP, which is totally appropriate, right?
Yeah,
But when I
absolutely.
first looked at it, I thought, oh, they're asking Glennis Patterson a question.
Mm-hmm. I know.
The same way my husband talks about RVT files, which is something, he's a nurse, and they do it's a procedure for heart rhythm, basically. So I'm like, it's not the same RVT.
Well, so let's go ahead and close this one.
Yep, we're up almost to the 80%.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do it. All right, and
okay, let's share that information.
Yep. All right, so here's the results. Yeah, so as infrequently as possible, that's a good answer. And then again, we see regularly for family management, right? So again, are they family-based parameters that don't need to be scheduled, but do they control visibility, or you're talking about like a thickness is something that again doesn't need to be scheduled. That makes sense. And then again, we also have a pretty even split really between frequently for both family and project management, regularly, and as infrequently as possible. So, all right.
I'm going to go ahead and hide that.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
Before we move on, I just want to also just a quick one. I know I'm going to put Glennis on the spot. She had mentioned, Fred had a great question about combining, or he asked if there was a good method to combine shared parameter files. And I know Glennis had a comment on that.
It's a great question. It probably warrants a more detailed sort of sub question in there, but I'll just say quickly that, combining shared parameters, from one file or one text file and another, the simple way is, you can use Notepad to do that. And if you're careful, like don't use Excel, if there's formatting that's really important in there that you want to keep consistent. But usually when people talk about that, the other aspect of that problem is maybe what they really want to do is sort of merge the values, and so that's a separate problem, right? So if the goal is simply say, I have a shared parameter in this file and I want it to be in this other file, you can actually copy and paste them. You do need to worry about syntax, and you do need to worry about duplicates. But the technical answer is you could use Notepad, and just the file format's very, very important. So, don't ever use Excel to do it. Don't open as a TXT file. Don't even Notepad++. I can't remember if it's safe, but you do have to be very careful with that. But the harder problem is merging, and that's one that we're really interested in addressing.
And I will say that not every shared parameter file has the same columns in it.
Yeah.
So
right. Yeah. Good point. Thanks.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks everybody for the polls. Jesika is going to go ahead and speak, and she's going to talk about some of the more in-depth parameter information that everybody should be aware of. So, Jesika, the floor is yours.
Before I get started, I wanted to mention that we may run out of time, and I know that a lot of people may need to stop at 10. We are going to keep recording even if we run long, so hopefully we can get to everything everyone wants to hear. So here I'm more in the deeper side of parameters. I spent a lot of time working with them. There's a lot of quirks to them that you see on the API that you don't really see on the UI, or maybe you do but don't understand them. So I just kind of cover some of the information I am aware of. First of all, there's been a lot of changes lately. I'll go into detail about those changes towards the end of my presentation, But as a result of those changes, there are some compatibility issues that are showing up in shared parameter files. And these are 2 snippets from knowledge articles that Autodesk has put out. And I've highlighted both the problem and their stated solution for each of these. And they actually have different solutions if you look at them. So the first one has to do with unit types. Those are actually started to be changed in 2021. And in that particular knowledge article, they told you to upgrade your Revit file, which a lot of people didn't think was very funny. The other one, which is in 2022, they added a lot of new categories to Revit. If you want to use a family type parameter, which is tied to a category, and you pick one of those new categories, you will not be able to open that shared parameter file in older versions of Revit. So, and these are probably going to continue to happen, these kind of upgrade ideas with shared parameters. And Revit's not very nice about opening files with stuff it doesn't understand, which is part of the reason you have to be careful about editing them and merging them. If you want to show the next slide there, Sash. So one of the things is just having a strategy in your company for dealing with this situation. And these are like the 4 major ways to handle it. Either start versioning your shared parameter files, that you have one that works in each version of Revit. That's not a lot of fun, especially when it comes to adding new stuff and, like we've talked about, combining files. The second item is just to not use any of the new features and stick with the stuff that works in every version of Revit. It's not very exciting, but there may not be features that you feel compelled to use anyways. The third, which is the one no one's actually going to do, is to have all your projects on the same version of Revit. It seems very, very unlikely. And the final one is that if you do make changes to your shared parameter file that's not compatible with old versions of Revit, you just stop putting shared parameters files in those older projects, which also seems unlikely. I wanted to also bring up that the terms people use for parameters, they're changing. And like a lot of things in Revit, being able to talk about things clearly is the important starting point. So if you are talking about parameters, there are some confusing terms, and you may be talking past each other on your team if you don't understand that they are talking about the same thing you are, but using different words for them. So I wanted to highlight some of the differences that could cause some confusion. So in this screenshot, I have highlighted 3 different items. The green says parameter type in a couple of the windows. It's referring to whether it's shared or not shared, really. In this case, it's project only, because in these UIs, you can't see the family and the project stuff at the same time. But in the API, it's called get data, type ID, which is getting more than just whether it's shared or not shared. There's other ways to find out it's a shared parameter. But if you have someone in your company that's using the API, they may be using different terms than what you're used to seeing in the API or in the UI. The biggest one I find in the forums and even in-house as a challenge is the data type of the parameter, which is what they call it in the API. But in the UI, it was type of parameter, not to be confused with parameter type. I am finding that using the word parameter type is a little loaded, and maybe using alternative terms is better. And then in 2022, they gave it a new name. So that screenshot in the middle with the filtering, that's a new 2022 feature where you can filter your project parameters. It is collapsed by default, so you may not notice it. But if you expand it, there it uses the term value type. And so there are 3 different names for this particular concept. So just having discussion in-house with your team about what you're actually talking about when you use different terms, maybe actually defining them somewhere for people to reference might be a good exercise to do. And it applies to more than just these parameter ideas. There's other things in Revit too that can get confusing. And you want to do the next slide there, Sash? So the other thing I see on the forums a lot when I'm looking around trying to solve my own problems is people getting confused by shared parameters doing things that they don't expect them to be doing. One of the things is it's a shared parameter file that's been added to your project, but it's read-only. You can't change it for some reason. Another is that it shows up on some elements and not others, which is a feature with it's hidden and doesn't have value. And the final one is it's not listed anywhere, but you keep getting this message that says it's already been added. Because it actually is there, but it will not show it to you in any UI at all. So all of these are features that were added to Revit to help support people doing add-ins or macros or Dynamo who are maybe doing some calculations, or they want to make a certain environment for putting inputs in so that you only can input certain parameters when it's useful and hide the ones that you don't want them to input when it's not useful. And a lot of these are tied to the API. The API has access to these things where you may not have access to them in the UI. So if you run into a weird situation, it might be from one of the tools you've installed, it might be from some in-house development, and that's kind of where you should start looking for why these things are, where they're coming from and why they're doing what they're doing. So if you want to show the next one, here's some examples. I made a shared parameter file with an example of kind of each one. You'll notice the one on the left, there are 5 items, and then the one in the middle, I've added all of them, but the top one is not listed because that's the one that will not show in UI ever, even though it's added to the project. And then on the right, I show 2 different elements, one of which has the values filled in for those ones that say they're sometimes relevant or sometimes visible. They will hide if they don't have a value, and in the API, you can clear those values so they can disappear again. So this is kind of showing where you might see inconsistencies in Revit and why those are happening. And then one of the things we want to talk about is like, these changes are important. We are very much invested in handling these differences between Revit versions. We support 4 versions at a time. Whenever we make a bug fix, it goes into all 4 of those. When we bring in new features of Revit, we do our best to make them as backwards compatible as we can. Of course, the API may not let us do that. But we are also planning for the future. As the API changes, we try and be proactive in preparing for those changes. So in this last slide, there we go. Here's a list of the actual changes we've seen in the API. So in 2020 is when you first got access to that hide the value, or hide when the value is empty. In 2021, there was some shifting of unit type, but in 2022 is when most of the changes have happened. Now in the API, they generally give us a year to adopt the changes that they give us before they take away the old code. So right now with 2022, all this stuff has been added. The anticipation is that that old code is going to start going away. So you may see tools break, you might have people developing stuff in-house that are going to have some struggles as they're forced to adopt the new APIs, and they are very different for 2022 than they were in the past. So the biggest change is, well, there's 2 changes. There used to be a unit type idea and a parameter type idea. Those have been both merged into the same property called data type, and that is because they were basically the same thing, and having them as separate values didn't really make sense. And so they've taken the time with all the rest of the work they've done to bring those together. The other big change is the Forge type ID, which can be a little confusing in terms of the name they've used. It doesn't actually connect to Forge, but it's probably inspired by data structures that started on Forge. And the best way to describe it is it's more flexible, more dynamic than the previous APIs they had before. I have a personal hope that it might lead to some more customization of parameters as they are less hard-coded and more dynamic, but we have yet to see if that will actually happen. So a lot of these things have changed. A Forge type ID is very different than the previous values, and any code that's out there has to deal with this change, and it's not a small change. So be gentle to your in-house developers, give them time to deal with it, and be aware that this is could break other things too, and it's going to be some compatibility issues going forward that we're doing our best to make sure we don't fall into.
Woohoo! You squeezed it all in. Woo!
Yeah, impressive. All right. Well, Jessica, thank you. That was amazing. So everybody can see here that we're staying on top of all this as we continue to improve our software and stay ahead of Autodesk's next move, shall we say. But let's go ahead and open this up to some Q&A. Glennis, Richard, I'm not sure if you want to read some questions aloud, or we'll go ahead and unmute the audience here as well if they want to ask some questions, but let's go ahead and do that.
I think one of the things you mentioned earlier, Sash, was that Tom had mentioned we can't use shared parameter as a key value. And you were, I don't know, you were saying you were going to come back to that. I guess that was in response to the new features.
Yeah, I mean, I should get some clarification from Tom on that.
Unmute,
Tom,
right? Yeah.
yeah, let's go ahead and unmute everybody, which you're not going to automatically be unmuted, but you can then have the ability to do that. So Tom, you can unmute yourself if you want to jump in and clarify that question.
So I was going to use this for a workflow for calculating occupancy loads for rooms.
Yep.
And we have a defined list of occupancy types with associated values for each of those.
Mm-hmm.
And so the ideal thing would be pick your occupancy type and the value is set.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those should be shared parameters because we
So
want them in a schedule, we want them in a tag, we want them in a lot of places, right?
Mm-hmm.
But with a key schedule, you have to define an independent key value.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I meant by that.
That's the
Yep.
part that can't be shared. Yeah.
Yep, that's exactly
And so what
it.
ends up happening is you now have to add another
Fake it. Yeah.
another level of construct. Well, and probably that's a good point is you just duplicate it
Yeah.
and have them tied together. I didn't think of it that way. It can be it. The other thing that I found interesting about key values when I was playing with this in 2022 is you would think that the key value should be a key, meaning somewhat like a key value
Unique.
in a database.
Like it would
Yeah.
be unique, Tom? Is that what you mean?
Well, I mean, I'm just throwing it out there, logic and stuff. But
yeah, they can
it
have
isn't.
duplicate values. Great. Yeah, we've run into that problem.
And I don't know what kind of mess that creates, but I was like, oh, that's wonderful. That's just cool.
That's a really good tip because I know we had in BIM Link early on, we had a couple customers who were doing that. And the classic example is like area schemes where you want to have like effectively like a duplicate key schedule for each area scheme, but you want it like you're naming it the same thing. So you end up with kind of parameters that have the exact same name, and Revit doesn't enforce uniqueness on that, and it is a little hairy scary. It's definitely a best practice to not do that.
Well, and this is something that's bugged me for years, and maybe somebody knows a way to do this, but I actually like the serialization of mark values and type marks being, forced unique kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to add that functionality into any of our own parameters? I don't think there is, but I was just going to throw it out there.
Great Revit forums idea.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anything like that. That is a great idea.
Yeah, no.
Well,
It's along the lines of having limited values that you can control, making up your own drop downs.
Right.
Anybody else from the audience want to unmute themselves and ask a question or make a comment or share an experience? Brian, I know you may.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. I know Brian had some comments earlier.
Comments. I don't know if the thing for me, the other thing I don't think you really showed too much of, Sash, when you're in there, is global parameters can also be associated to formulas. So for me, I use a lot of formulas with the global parameters, and that's kind of the theory on the presentation I've done for global parameters as design alternatives. Is basically toggle option A or option B, and that would control 50 or 60 other things where I could literally change an entire design just by toggling one switch, kind of like the turn off for plot, but it involved about 30 or 40 formulas.
Got it. Yeah, that's an interesting. So do you have some examples of what you're toggling?
Yeah, I actually have a presentation. I actually have a file open if you want it. I gave a presentation for Built Virtual, but the where I came up with this a few years ago was at a client who, on the exterior of the building, they had a curtain wall system, and they needed the curtain wall mullions to move. But if the curtain wall mullions moved, they also then needed the reveals to move. Once those reveals moved, there was a window sitting between the height of those reveals. So basically, the entire skin would change between option A and option B. If we were using design options, you would have to basically duplicate the entire scan of the building and have the two different options just to move reveals up and down, etc. Window heights, things like that. So we associated type properties to windows. We associated dimension and associated parameters to it. We even added a generic annotation with a formula that basically would toggle or would link to a global parameter. If you toggled A in the elevation, it would say option A. If you toggled B, it would say option B. And literally it would change in their particular project about a couple hundred things. So it wasn't I could have sheet 1 and sheet 2, print them at the same time. I had to print sheet 1, toggle the button, print sheet 2, toggle the button if they wanted to print it. But that was a lot easier than duplicating the entire skin of a convention center.
Now, Brian, this is a good question that Ryan just asked. What about the implication of any Revit performance? With all those global parameters, have you seen any performance hits?
Only when you're accessing them. So the other thing that I have several clients doing now as well is linking global parameters to model and detail components. So they've got all their typical detail components for like slab edge, right? They're dimensioning from the grid line to slab edge or face of wall, whatever they're doing. And they have 30 or 40 global parameters to that. So if they change global parameter, scenario A, that changes the detail component, the detail assembly as well. But not only does it change that, they link that then to the sketch lines via a dimension, and they go in, and so if they change it in the global parameter, not only does the slab physically move in the model environment, it also then moves in the detail environment as well. And I have clients with hundreds of these things, and yes, when they're editing that one global parameter, go to lunch, depending on how many times you've got it associated. Kind of the same thing with the toggle between option A and option B. In that project, when we toggled that, it took some time, but I've not really noticed a performance issue having a lot of global parameters unless you're actually using it.
It has to be better than design options.
It depends for the scenario. If you're talking design options of laying furniture A out versus furniture B, you got design options for that. But in this example, we were like, I can't seriously duplicate the entire skin of this convention.
Exactly. Yeah. I think in that context, it's awesome.
Well, and like the wall reveals, we did the one wall reveal that went around the entire building. So we literally only had to do like 6 dimensions for the wall reveals around the entire thing. And the height of those wall reveals were controlled by that.
Here's another good question, kind of on more generally for, I guess, the whole team that James asked about suggestions on managing shared parameters when we have different market sectors, like education versus public safety. The needs differ, but we still have a lot of overlap. So are there any suggestions on when there's different disciplines like that, like or market sectors? I know, I guess it would maybe be creating groups of parameters.
But I also wonder if it's different, just parameter types.
Actually, James, you can unmute yourself if you want to expand on that a little bit more, if you feel comfortable.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi, sorry, I'm in a public space. I didn't want to. So we have some family types that are unique to certain market sectors, and with that comes certain parameters that we're trying to standardize, and we have a lot of overlap, obviously, just general building practices. But we wanted to keep things not too convoluted and complicated for the team to use. So we're kind of debating on having different parameter files per market sector, but then you run into a lot of maintenance of duplicate information, and you go from one file to the other, from one market sector to another, where we have one standard template that everyone's kind of using as a base file. So just kind of managing that in a way that's efficient, that doesn't create too much extra work, given we're a small team. So managing this stuff ourselves is a little hectic sometimes.
That's a great question. I think this is Glynis. I think it looks like Tom actually has. I don't know, Tom, if you're trying to weigh in on that particular question. I see you talking about do not have duplicate shared parameters in files, and that's certainly a good point. But are you talking, Tom? Were you trying to comment on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I have it based just out of sheer age. The shared parameter file that we have at our office is enormous, but the reason why it's all in one file is so that we know, so we have some kind of central source of truth. And with the way that the problem was described as being, we have multiple market sectors with some use the same or variations of the same parameters. And the problem being with multiple files is you end up with a possible, ooh, let me just add this over here and it'll be fine. And then the same thing gets added somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And it's now that duplicate GUID problem that Sash mentioned earlier. And now it's a big issue, right? Now you've got two reinforcement parameters or two windowsill heights, and they're called out the same, but they're showing up twice for different reasons in the project. And that's where the problem is. I mean, one of the biggest issues with shared parameters I see is that kind of management of where are the bodies stored. You know, getting a file from 10 years ago, you just inherited every shared parameter, every project level parameter in that project. And people do that stuff all the time. And there's just not a great way to do it. So the best that I could say is, I mean, you could codify it. Like these are, you know, come up with some scripts to bring those, hey, this is a workplace market sector. So we'll bring in these dozen, and you can do that really cleverly, right? There's ways to do that in a clever way. If they're project level parameters, create a schedule or schedules that use those parameters exclusively. Then you could just copy those schedules from project to project.
I love that idea. Yeah, for those. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of the, I mean, I've used that before I had, you know, the wealth of plugins that I have now, right? That's an easy, quick and dirty way to get a lot of parameters from one place to another as needed. And that's maybe one way to do it, to help you manage it. Like this one's this is the healthcare shared parameter project parameter schedule. And it's some multi-category schedule that just has everything dumped into it, and you copy and paste that into your project. It's either that, and well, yeah, we could talk about that for hours. There's a whole lot of strategy behind that, but I would not suggest having multiple files. It's going to drive you nuts.
Yeah, and it's easy to lose track of those little bits of files, which, you know, it comes back to the other questions like, how do I manage these multiple shared parameter files? So in this case, you know, Richard was mentioning kind of these parameter groups. Tom, if you had a kind of a general section for all projects, no matter what the typology is, and let's just say you would have a group maybe for education and maybe a group for a particular client then, but all in one file, is that correct?
Well, I think if I remember correctly, the functionality inside of a shared parameter file keeps you from being able to make duplicates.
Correct.
Like if you, so that's part of the issue. But one of the key things that I heard in the question was, you know, some of them, the problem I think is which ones are used. Like it's more of which ones do I use for this market sector? And yes, there are some specific ones, but it sounds like there's different mixes of the same parameters across those.
Right.
And that would be a different kind of, you know, it's like, how do you come up with the best strategy for that kind of, I don't know, it gets complicated. And you have to know more about it, right? There's a lot more to it than just what we're discussing right here.
Yeah.
But I think you're right, though. The groups would be a good start.
Yeah. Yep. As opposed to saying I have door parameters, window parameters, it's in the grouping, maybe per market sector or client or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a tricky one because you can't do a subcategory within there for doors, windows. It's basically, you know, major category then subcategories. So
yeah.
Another interesting question. I know we're kind of up against our time limit here, but I thought this was good from John. Maybe Jesika can chime in. Has there been any change in the ability to perform functions on text-based parameters?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe what John was talking about is like having the actual text embedded, like be a parameter itself, like embedded in the note?
I was testing some of that just recently with global parameters in particular, which have formula support, just like in families. And the text-based formulas don't really seem to exist yet still, unfortunately.
Okay.
Or you could just use Excel and do it there, but I'm just saying.
I mean, that is the magic key to a ton of automation.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right. Well, I know we've gone over time. I want to just thank everybody for joining us today, for spending some extra time with us. I really appreciate it. As you know, this is always a big discussion. I think we could probably do the same discussion every year and still get a big audience and still get a lot of questions. So that definitely shows that there's a lot going on with parameters. There's a lot of information, use cases. We can see people using them in very different manners. So I love having this kind of conversation. Just a couple reminders. Oh, go ahead, Glennis, were you gonna say something?
This is Jessica. I was gonna say, there are definitely some API limitations for parameters in Revit. I encourage everyone to go on Revit Ideas and vote for the things that you want, because that's how we get new stuff.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, definitely. If you haven't been in the Revit Ideas Forum, Autodesk is policing that very carefully. They are looking at ideas. People are voting them up and they're implementing them. So if there's something you want to see, be sure to go to the Revit Ideas and vote it up. And if you don't see a topic there, go ahead and create a new one and tell your friends about it so they can go vote it up as well. Just real quickly before we finish up, a couple action items. Check out our website. We do have some updates available, so be sure to check for those, or you can go into the in product and check for updates, and we'll let you know if there's an update available. Also, don't forget the survey at the end. It's just a few questions there, but also if you want to join our beta program, please check yes, and we will send you some instructions on joining the beta. That's all that I have. I want to thank you all once again for joining us. Glennis, Richard, Jessica, the audience, I want to thank you all very much for your time today. This has been very helpful, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
I really appreciate the feedback. Everyone have a great day.
Thanks, Ash. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you guys as well. Appreciate it.